And all the evidence indicates that we're not quite as good as we think. And there are all sorts of cognitive and motivational biases at play. And then you see the same thing in the learning process. If you look at afterwards at how did things go, what did we learn from that, we tend to be very biased. So I think there's lots and lots of factors. I mean, I've written a book about this stuff and I sort of had a model on it, but if I was going to drill to one, my thinking on it has evolved over time, and it's what I would call a better understanding of reality. Obviously there are lots of factors around people, processes, leadership, all the things that high performance teams generally get right. But I think the one issue that's prevalent almost to any organization is their ability to deal with reality. And you see it both in the planning and decision-making process and the learning process, that hopefully there's some sort of feedback loop, that when we do any sort of planning, if it's in any situation of ambiguity or imperfect information, which the vast majority of situations are, especially as you get more senior and you're dealing with more strategic things, you're then having to apply judgment to make the decision, because we don't have all the answers. And the problem with judgment is we're quite wedded to our own brilliance at it and think we're really good at it. And all the evidence indicates that we're not quite as good as we think. And there are all sorts of cognitive and motivational biases at play. And then you see the same thing in the learning process. If you look at afterwards at how did things go, what did we learn from that, we tend to be very biased. There's a great little model in psychology called actor-observer bias that explains this. Is if you're an observer of something and you weren't involved in it, you're neutral, you tend to have a fairly objective view of it. But if you're an actor in the middle of it, especially if it didn't go so well, you tend to have a highly subjective view, and we tend to blame the situation, the organization, somebody else. Not many of us run around and go, yo, it was me, screwed up, no bonuses for anybody this year. And organizations actually don't incentivize this. And so in the same way that we tend to be biased in our decision making under ambiguity, we can have the same biases in our learning in terms of how we attribute cause and effect. And I think the key to both of these things, they're just two sides of the same coin, is our ability to have the real conversation, to leverage cognitive diversity, to stress test and challenge each other, to remove hierarchy in these decisions. What you want to get away from is the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. It requires some intellectual humility, especially from more senior people. So to join all those things together, it's all about trying to get this better understanding of reality, that both our decision making and our learning is based on the best possible approximation that we can get to what's actually going on here. I think the answer to that is relatively straightforward. It's on attitude and skill. But the fact that it's simple to understand doesn't necessarily mean it's easy in practice. That when we're faced with the reality of having to hire somebody, clearly we don't want to screw up and we don't want to be blamed for getting the wrong person. So we tend to go on a bit of a skill tick box type exercise. And have they done it before? What's their track record? And less, to be honest, in my experience, on attitude and fit. And I think what you see in high performance teams is they place an equal value on both of those things. So in fact, my experience on the Red Arrows is quite relevant here, that we have a selection process. We get it down to the final 9 candidates each year, and the final 9 spend a week with the team. And in that week, you do 3 things with them. You do an interview, a flying test, and the rest of the week is just spending time with the team, people forming an opinion on what sort of person you are. And I know that some people will argue that in itself is a highly biased process, and that's difficult for me to defend. But I think the learning is still interesting. The interview is a kind of formality. The flying test is the interesting one. That's the skill test. And the flying test is like a line in the sand. You have to be on or over the line. And being a long way over the line is a good thing. That will help you. But I can promise you hand on heart from experience that the team will take somebody who's marginal on that line, who's got the right attitude, who's a team player, over somebody who's a brilliant with a huge ego, because that person will drag the team down eventually. And when you look at other teams, you see it, there's a great book about the All Blacks that talks about some of their stuff. You see it in the Lionesses, the football, and also the Irish field hockey team was a great example a few years ago, an amateur team that was a bunch of women who were all part-time and were runners-up in the World Cup. And you see the same themes again and again. And a really good corporate example I like is Netflix. They put a lot of stuff in the public domain about culture and values, and you see the same stuff, that they will not carry a brilliant person just unless they actually fit into the whole team dynamic as well. So I think with leadership, it's the most underrated quality in a lot of environments, in the corporate environment. And corporates obviously take it seriously and do a lot of work on leadership development, but I think there are 3 key attributes you need in your best ever executive, or more likely your best ever executive team. And it's the ability to set clear direction, to articulate and cascade intent. And this is pretty much an intellectual activity. Then you need to be able to deliver results, make stuff happen. Well, this is a physical activity. It's not physical like going to the gym or lifting weights or something, but it's physical in that stuff happens. And if you isolate those two and say they're really important capabilities, but they're not leadership, the one that you get left with as leadership is bringing other people on the journey with you. And framed like that, that's a moral and emotional activity. It's other people's choice. If they follow you because they have to, that's seniority, that's not leadership. And so if you think of it in terms of those 3 capabilities, what's the thing that gets you on in an organization? What gets you promoted? Well, I would argue at the early stages of your career, it's always going to be delivery. And then as you get a little bit more senior, it's probably some combination of delivery and the intellect bit as well. And leadership's almost the optional add-on. You can get a long way, sometimes to the very top of an organization, without necessarily being great at the EQ stuff, the emotional engagement, the bringing people with you. But the problem with it is when things go wrong, and when it hits the fan, that's the time when the leadership stuff gets really exposed and when you need it most of all. And it's undoubtedly the thing that can add the most value and make the most difference almost at any time. However, as I say, it ends up by default almost being the discretionary add-on a lot of the time. So I would hope they would get 2 things from them really. One would be some sort of, I guess, motivation. I laugh because I say that because I'm always very sensitive to, if somebody introduces me as a motivational speaker, I'm always like, oh my God, if I was in the audience now, I would just be sat there saying, come on then, motivate me, let's see what you've got. And the honest truth is, I don't see myself as that, and I don't set out to motivate per se. But I would hope that there would be a genuine positive buzz and some element of that when you deliver. But then the other thing I would like to do is give them some clear, simple insights that you can apply the next day. That I'm not naive, and I don't promise naive either. I don't tell people I'm going to change the world in an hour or half a day or a day. But equally, I don't want to just be in the business of a bit of rah, rah, rah. I want them to take away a few things that are clear enough and simple enough that they could go and do them straight away. I think that's a great question. At the time, I wouldn't have thought of it in these sorts of terms that I'll use now, because it was just the J job and what you do. But I think in hindsight, there are kind of 2 approaches broadly to managing risk. One is that you equip and empower people with the tools and the permission to make decisions for the unique situations they're facing. And the other one is you try and sort of have an answer for every question. You have a standard operating procedure for everything. And I saw an interesting example actually with an oil company, with an executive who stood up and said, yeah, in the perfect world, when an oil rig goes in for a turnaround, it happens about every 4 years. He said, in between times, we would like to automate everything we can for that 4 years. But the problem is that something will happen in that time that we couldn't have predicted and therefore is not automated. And that's the one time that we need a human to step in, and we're not giving them much practice at it. And when I look back in my sort of military time, we were equipped and empowered pretty effectively. And I think there were 3 levels for decision making and managing risk. One is that we did use standard operating procedures. And so if you can predict it, if it happens lots of times, especially if it's safety critical, then yeah, have a process for it and follow the process. Don't waste your brain power reinventing the wheel. Then we have what you might call dynamic rehearsal, things that you can kind of predict. You sort of think this might happen at some point, but you can't predict exactly what it will look like at the time when it happens or when it will happen. And for that, we do what I'd call this dynamic rehearsal. Every time we'd fly, we'd have a sortie brief. At the end of the brief, we'd be talking about what if, what could go wrong, what's the worst thing today, or what's the worst thing that could affect us more generally. And we quickly drill into that and have it, drill into what would happen here, who would do what. And we'd only spend a few minutes on it. But what happens over time is if you're constantly having that conversation, you sort of build this mental database of things that might go wrong. And when things do go wrong, you dip in the database. You don't just make it up. The decision that we made in the crew room, having a coffee, is always going to be better than the decision you make under enormous stress in the heat of the moment. We try to make the high pressure decisions in low pressure environments. And the final bit is what you might call the unknown unknowns, the third level. So you've got the standard procedures, you've got the dynamic rehearsal, the contingency planning. Level 3 is the thing you couldn't possibly have predicted. And of course, the thing with level 3 is that's generally the one that will really, do you over. The things that destroy enormous shareholder value or impact lives, or almost by definition, the ones you couldn't have predicted. Otherwise, you would have a process for them. And for those ones, what we'd have is absolutely clear, simple priorities to fall back on. If there's no realistic plan at all for this, you need to have real clarity in what's the ball I can't afford to drop, because you are going to drop balls in that situation. And it boils down to these absolutely clear, simple priorities.